Thank you very much, Paul. It's a great pleasure. It's a privilege to be having this opportunity to exchange some thoughts about what I think is a very important moment in human history. I say this because I believe we're in the midst of a remarkable transformation in human affairs. And this has come about as a result of many factors, not least the extraordinary succession of upheavals of the last 100 years, which together and cumulatively have radically altered life as we knew it. Just think back. 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Holocaust, the advent of nuclear weapons, the Cold War, and more recently, climate change, itself emblematic of the deeper ecological crisis we now see all around us. And also a series of financial crises and pandemics, the one that's still with us, perhaps the most daunting, and violent fundamentalisms, and even more violent great power interventions that have left everywhere a trail of profound social and psychological trauma. And I think it's important to remind ourselves, living as we do in Australia, that all of this, without exception, has occurred under the West's watch. So one thing I think is becoming clear as we move into the 21st century. The world that was ushered in by Europe's reawakening, which we associate with the Renaissance, the voyages of exploration, the expansion of trade, the emergence of the centralized monarchies in Europe, all of that and much that followed is now coming to an end. The foundational principles of what came to be known as the modern epoch, let's try and identify them very as succinctly as we can. State sovereignty, nationalism, more benignly expressed as national self-determination, empire building premised on Western dominance of the non-Western world, the ever-widening technological application of the natural sciences, and importantly, of course, capital accumulation. By the 19th century, these principles had become global in scope and inspiration. And over time, the modern epoch's intellectual and institutional foundations, however, became subject to very powerful pressures from within and without. From within, largely as a result of the very growth of Western societies, economic and in many other ways, technological, the growth of Western societies, the rise, and in particular, the rising scale, the speed, and the intensity of what we now call cross-border flows, better known as globalization. The flow of goods and services, of technology, of money, arms, carbon emissions, pathogens, people, images, information. And it's the cumulative impact of these flows on just about every sphere of human activity, which has given rise to a series of limits. Things that we thought were paramount and central now increasingly appear limited. Limits to sovereignty, state sovereignty. Limits to empire and empire building. Limits to identity, and in particular national identity, as the supreme norm of governance. Limits to economic growth, and even limits to science and technology. We're seeing that by the rejection of science in so many practical ways, not least during the COVID pandemic we're going through now. And the net effect of all these limits has been to erode the coherence, the viability of the modern project, and with it, the West's global ascendancy. I'll say more about that in a moment. All of which has enormous implications for Australia, by the way. But my primary aim in this set of remarks is to think about the global picture and just touch on at the end at what this may imply for Australia. And hopefully in discussion, we can spend a lot more time focusing on the Australian dimension. So I was saying, subjected to powerful pressures from within, the very nature of the Industrial Revolution and all that has flown from it. And secondly, resistance of the East, most graphically encapsulated in the struggles for independence in Asia, well, first of all in Latin America, and then in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Struggles that were at times political, in some ways cultural, and at times violent. All of this coming together appears to be indicating the relative decline of the West and the corresponding rise, or re-emergence, I should say, of other centers of power and influence. And this then leads us to, if this is at all accurate, this leads us to the very complex but crucial question: what does all this mean for the human future, for the planet's future, and of particular concern to us, of course, for Australia's future? So the key proposition I'm putting to you is that we are witnessing a shift of far-reaching proportions, which has been underway for some little time. And it is a shift that calls for and makes possible a new approach, I believe, to humane and legitimate governance. So what is this shift? It is one which involves, first, a profound economic and geopolitical transformation. What I think we are seeing is the emergence of what I call a multi-centered world, or a multi-centric world, in which several major centers of wealth and military, diplomatic, organizational clout, some rising, others declining, are furiously competing either to continue their ascent or to arrest their decline. So what this means, to put it crudely, is a shift in the center of economic and geopolitical gravity away from the West and towards the East, or, as I prefer to call it, from the Occident to the Orient. Now, the key to this, or at least the initial key to this, has been Asia's renewed economic dynamism, and in particular, East Asia, of course, of particular relevance to Australia, not just because of proximity. And in this context, experts and commentators have rightly focused on China's rise. The scale of the Chinese economic miracle is certainly remarkable. Since the introduction of market reforms in 1979, only about 40 years ago, since that time, China's real annual gross domestic product has averaged, and it's quite unbelievable, really, an annual growth rate, year in, year out, averaged out, of 9.5%. Its GDP, gross domestic product, has doubled every 8 years. Its manufacturing output has overtaken that of Japan. It did that in 2007, and that of the United States in 2010. It is now the world's largest economy in terms of parity pricing, in terms of purchasing power, and it will be the world's largest economic power within 10 to 15 years by any indicator. So in the space of a few decades, China has achieved what the World Bank has described, and I quote, the fastest sustained expansion by a major economy in human history. It is a remarkable development. Never seen before, and probably it'll be a very, very long time before we see it again, if ever. So we're in the midst of an economic transformation of unimaginable implications. And yet, China's rise, though it is very important, doesn't fully capture the profound changes now sweeping across the globe and reshaping the social and political fabric of many countries. Because in addition to China, Asia's re-emergence as a pillar of the global economy now encompasses virtually the whole of East Asia. Japan preceded China. It became established as a major economic center in the early 20th century and resumed soon after its defeat in World War II. It was followed by the rise then of the tiger economies, in particular South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, which got going in the 60s and early 70s. And more recently, we've seen the takeoff of the Indian economy, the rise of a large middle class, an Indian middle class, which is larger than the total population of the United States, and an annual economic growth of nearly 4.4% over the last 30 or more years. And complementing this picture is the unexpected growth of several Southeast Asian economies, in particular, Indonesia and Vietnam. Indonesia has recorded an average growth rate, economic growth rate, of 5% over the last 20 years, and Vietnam has lifted 45 million people, or a bit over, out of poverty over the last 15 to 20 years. It's expected that Asia's gross domestic product, it is now estimated, I should say, not expected, estimated, that Asia's gross domestic product has overtaken the rest of the world combined. And within 8 to 9 years, we expect Asia to contribute to 60% of the world's total growth. And while that is happening, the US economy, which has been the super economy in the world, has kept shrinking in the last several years. Just as recently as the year 2000, 20 years or so ago, the United States accounted for nearly 25%, a quarter, of the world's total economic output. This declined to just 20% in 2010, and it now stands at well under 15%. Wow. Many factors have contributed to it. Global financial crisis is one, and of course, the diminishing share of global trade is another. The diminishing share of America's place in the global trading system. But now we are learning, we should have learned it a long time ago, but some people, some of us are perhaps slow learners. Side by side with the shrinking of America's economic supremacy in the world has been the inability of the United States to use military power to get its own way. At face value, US military capabilities radiate power, but that power has proved illusory. Yes, of course, if you were to judge it by military spending, the United States military budget currently stands at $780 billion, or close to $780 billion. There is, we see it, the flexing of military muscle on a global scale. But what we see is that in the major confrontations involving US power, it's hardly ever now translated into victory on the ground. The United States left Vietnam utterly humiliated. 1975. We should have been able to read the signs of the times, but many of us did not. It was in fact foreshadowed by the Korean War more than 20 years earlier, in which all that the United States could do in Korea, after 3 years of extraordinary bloodletting on both sides, all it could do was to end up in a draw. And since Vietnam, we have seen the disastrous war in Iraq, in which the principal beneficiary has been Iran, the protracted, punishing, and utterly humiliating conflict in Afghanistan, the end of which we're witnessing as we speak, and the unholy mess in Libya and Syria, all signs of the fragility of US power. Not that it doesn't have enormous military muscle at its disposal, but that muscle is proving less and less usable for purposes of imposing American will on the political, social, cultural, and economic landscape. That is the message. And of course, the power that he thought it had defeated utterly, as expressed in the end of the Cold War, Russia, now no longer is willing or feels the need to comply with the US interests and priorities, as seemed to be the case in the 1990s. Putin's Russia is busily modernizing its military arsenal. It's reasserting its influence, primarily around its periphery and in the Middle East. And of course, for its part, China is now intent on exerting political influence commensurate with its new economic status, most strikingly reflected in the projection of power in the South China Sea, but much more breathtaking, China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, sometimes referred to as the New Silk Road, which the United States simply cannot even begin to think of matching. What's envisaged is a vast network, global network of railways, energy pipelines, highways, infrastructure projects, and some 50 special economic zones stretching from China to the outer limits of Africa. And of course, including the whole of Western Europe. It has already led to agreements with 80 countries, accounting for 2/3 of the world's population. And the ambitions are not just economic, they are political, and in many ways, they are cultural. And the word cultural leads me to focus on another dimension, often overlooked, yet crucial to the shape of things to come. Economics and geopolitics and trends in that area assume their full significance only when placed against a wider backdrop. And that backdrop is cultural and civilizational. We are moving not just towards a multicentric world, as I was saying at the beginning, in the sense of economics and politics. we are moving towards a multi-civilisational world. The West-centric model, in which first Europe and then the United States held sway, is now giving way to a new world in which other centers, civilizational centers, are emerging or re-emerging. It is what I call a civilizational shift of historic proportions. Of course, different civilizations coexisted in the modern period, but such coexistence was always subject in the last 2 or 3 centuries to European and later American ascendancy. And a marked tendency on the part of Western economic, political, religious, and intellectual elites to view non-Western civilizations as inferior. As Robert Cox aptly put it, and I quote, "Imperialism and its accompanying scholarship defined the non-European civilizations as mere objects of knowledge. European civilization and its American offshoot was to be thought as dynamic, as an active agent in history, inspired by the doctrine of progress, whereas non-European civilizations were thought of as passive and fixed," end of quote. In other words, as a consequence of its dominance, global dominance, economic, political, military, one could say cultural, the West, the Occident, came to believe in the universality of its culture and to measure world human progress in the light of its own achievements. However, in the space of these last few decades, the major Eastern civilizations that comprise the Orient, and here I'm thinking primarily of 3 spheres, cultural spheres. The Sinic sphere, which involves much more than China, but it includes Taiwan, Hong Kong, and all the Chinese minorities around Southeast Asia, East Asia, and beyond, and not least the Chinese minority in Australia. And then the Indian or Hindu sphere, some would call it, but Indian sphere, and of course the Islamic cultural sphere, which is perhaps the most heterogeneous of the 3. All of them, in different ways, have made a dramatic reappearance on the world stage in the last 30 to 50 years. So the point I'm making is there's more to this shift than a power shift. It is a cultural shift. Now, this is not uniform. This civilizational shift is not uniform. It expresses itself differently within and between civilizations. The mix of religious, linguistic, political, ethnic, national, and racial sensibilities that give effect to this shift vary considerably from one sphere to another, and even within different parts of the same sphere. In some cases, it is buttressed by growing economic muscle, as in China. In others, by the adroit use of soft power, as is the case with some other East Asian countries. And in others still, especially in the Islamic world, by the politics of rage and despair. Cumulatively, there is no doubt about the impact of this shift. And the indications I suggest are as significant and certainly more rapid than the shift we associate with Europe's and subsequently America's rise. So I'm putting forward the very provocative thesis that the shift that we're seeing may have even more dramatic consequences for the world, for better or for worse, than the shift that led to Europe's rise from the Renaissance onwards, right through to the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and all that went with them. So the cultural values, the political ground rules, the organizational self-confidence, which have been the hallmark of Western ascendancy, are now under severe challenge. And the challenge is going to become increasingly powerful in the years ahead. This trend is visible in different contexts and assumes different forms. And it's interesting to note, just as a footnote, how the pandemic has been dealt with and affected China, and how it has been dealt with and affected the United States. Just note the economic fallout of the pandemic in the United States, the political fallout in the United States, and the ability of the Chinese, even though we associate China with the origins of the pandemic, to sail through virtually unaffected. Its rate of economic growth over the first 5 years, 2020 to 2025, in that growth, the pandemic will be little more than a minor blip. Let us reflect a little more on the last 25 years, closer to 30 actually, since the end of the Cold War. At the end of that Cold War, late 80s, 1989, 1990, many in the West, and in particularly in the United States, interpreted that extraordinary development, the end of the Cold War, as the ultimate triumph of the United States and the arrival of a new world order. Fukuyama, as you may recall, proclaimed the end of history, the end of conflict as we've known it. Economic and political liberalism was widely seen as the only game in town, the only rational model capable of delivering the good life. Globalization, in the minds of many, became synonymous with a globalization of liberalism. The free market was seen as unfettered by regulation, together with the freedoms espoused by liberal democracy, as representing the final consolidation of human history. The victory of liberalism was said to have exorcised, or at least tamed more or less permanently, the two most damaging features of international society, according to this view. These two features being authoritarianism and violent upheaval. Now, this view did seem plausible at first sight, but we now know this was a deeply flawed thesis. Successive US administrations were inclined to uphold this reading of history, largely because it lent weight to US primacy in world affairs. But it did little to legitimate America's vision of the future. Far too many remained unconvinced. Too many conflicts and divisions persisted. Too many identities were intent on finding their voice. And within a few years, the promised new order was little more than a distant memory. The loudly proclaimed triumph of liberal democracy and the free market now gave way to notions of rogueness. We weren't supposed to see rogueness in the world. To the war on terror, to military expeditions, to the China threat, to trade disputes, to the pursuit of narrowly defined self-interest, and in due course, to the dangerous and false promises that it would be possible to make America great again, the Trump version, and that America is back, the Biden version. Because we know that in the United States and in most other parts of the Western world, the unfettered market had led to rising and extraordinary inequalities and growing marginalization. And this has been one of the most important factors driving what we see primarily in the United States, but in many parts of Western Europe, namely the psychology of seething discontent and the politics of mindless rage. Think back to the assault on Capitol Hill. Think back to the rise of fascism and the extreme far right in so many parts of Western Europe. Seething discontent. And it's against this backdrop that we have seen the emergence of the so-called Asian versus Western values debate, first in the 80s and 90s in a crude form, and now in a somewhat more sophisticated form. It's not just political elites, but intellectual and cultural elites in many parts of the Western world that now regard Western discourse as prejudicial to their interests, to their identity, to their sense of who they are. Some see Western discourse as possibly jeopardizing the delicate fabric and political stability of their societies. Others want to develop new forms of regional and international collaboration, better attuned to their own cultural and civilizational traditions. The net effect is to call into question the hegemony of Western discourse. So there are important civilizational differences in the world in which we live. These differences exist, they are not illusory, and they are certainly not unimportant. But in addition to differences, there are, of course, important commonalities and complementarities, which we would be remiss to ignore. Most civilizations, despite their many differences, share a sense of cosmic interconnectedness, an appreciation of the dignity of human life, a commitment to human fulfillment, and a concern for standards of rightness in human conduct. I'm talking about the profound elements of different civilizations, not the behavior of certain political elites. Common to these traditions is the notion of legitimate governance. Although it is true, the criteria used to determine or define legitimacy may vary considerably from one tradition to another. And it is that which leads me to the following proposition. These areas of commonality make dialogue possible, and the differences make it indispensable. To put it in shorthand, commonality makes dialogue possible, and diversity makes it essential. So the question is whether these complex relationships can be channeled in mutually beneficial directions. That is the crucial question of our time. And if so, how, by whom, in what settings, and with what short or longer term objectives? We've seen two already very serious, polarizing, dangerous divides emerging in the post-Cold War period. The West versus the Islamic world, and now the West versus China. These conflicts are potent and they are dangerous. How dangerous and how potent we've seen in relation to the West's relationship with Islam. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and in other parts of the Middle East, and for that matter, even in Southeast Asia. And we're beginning to see how potent and dangerous it can be in the recent developments in relations between the West and China. There's much at stake here. What's at stake are changing forms of cultural identification, political allegiance, the notion of citizenship, and the very principles and mechanisms of governance. And much of this, interestingly enough, is being played out within the confines of Western societies. It's not just between the so-called West and China, or the West and the Islamic world, but inside the West, and for that matter, inside Australia. We need only see the profound tensions in much of Western Europe between the dominant Western worldview and that espoused by the increasingly numerous minorities within many European countries. Within 30 years, perhaps 40, 1/4 of France's population will be Muslim. Within 40 years, the dominant language in the United States will no longer be English, it will be Spanish. And it's amazing how little people are giving attention, how little attention people are giving to these developments. Even as of now, in Australia, 50% of the population was either not born in this country or has at least one parent not born in Australia. And within 20 to 25 years, it may well increase to 60%. Either not born in Australia or at least one parent not born in Australia. So there is a profound shift going on, not only across national borders between the West and the East, but it is reproducing itself inside societies, and in particular, inside Western societies. On a global scale, we can say that Western epistemology, with its bias on analytic thinking, has tended to segment and interpret society in zero-sum or adversarial terms. And the effect of this is to alienate the individual from the community, to place the individual in a kind of bubble that separates the individual from the community, separates the material from the non-material world, the private from the public sphere. By contrast, and this is a gross generalization, of course, the Orient is more inclined to place the accent on the connectedness of things and to view the relationship of tradition and modernity not as some kind of rigid binary opposition, you're either modern or you're traditional, but rather as a more fluid and complementary set of practices and principles. The Orient comprises several distinct civilizations, each with its own ethos and symbolism, but nevertheless, there are certain common characteristics. That's why it makes sense to speak of the Orient, just as it makes sense to speak of the West. Eastern civilizations have a different conception of political space. It's a conception that establishes a closer connection between human freedom and human need, between human rights and human obligations or responsibilities, between the individual and the community. Hence, this dual emphasis on individual rights and collective rights, and on rights and responsibilities. And of course, it'll come as no surprise, the Orient rejects Western dominance. It challenges the notion that the West has a permanent monopoly on the definition of what are to be the world's legal and political norms. It calls for a renegotiation of the rules that govern the international order. It calls for a process that includes all parties concerned, even if that means rethinking some of the rules that currently apply, some of the normative and legal standards that have been taken for granted during the period of Western dominance. These are crucial insights to which the West, by and large, has yet to offer a considered response. None of this is to obscure or to question the very significant contributions of the Western Enlightenment project, its emphasis on reasoned argument, the advance of scientific inquiry, technological advance, the celebration of civil and political liberties, constitutional government, and the separation of church and state. Nor is it to argue that yesterday's dominant discourse, the West's discourse, is about to be replaced or should be replaced by another discourse that emanates somehow from the Orient. Or to propose as the end goal, a universal ethic, which would somehow dilute or replace existing societal or civilizational identities. Rather, a careful reading of current trends points to something different, to the need for a new dialogical framework. A framework in which dialogue helps its civilizational interlocutors, including the likes of Australia and China, to better understand and constructively connect with the wisdom and experience of each other's traditions, very different traditions. Together, we must begin to explore the implications of all this for the contemporary human predicament. There is, it seems to me, no other way of doing it than through the dialogue of civilizations. A dialogue which goes way beyond merely understanding or tolerating the other. Nor can civilizational dialogue be confined to a small political elite or even to an intellectual elite. It has to permeate the whole institutions of society, its educational institutions, its cultural institutions, the conduct of everyday life. And that requires very, very serious thinking to be given by society and its citizens. A very careful attention paid to the following questions. Who can participate in this dialogue? Who can be equipped to participate in this dialogue? What are the educational and skilling requirements for the dialogical enterprise to have any reasonable chance of success? To put it crudely, to focus our minds, to what extent are Australia's educational institutions, from kindergarten right to postgraduate education in our universities, skilling a new generation to be able to participate in the dialogical enterprise? How can strategies be tailored to the particular settings and circumstances in which different societies are accustomed to which they're accustomed? What level and kind of coordination is needed if this dialogue is to become an intellectually coherent and recognizably fruitful enterprise? And that's why I'm saying that to pose these questions is to invite a reassessment of educational practice, not just the educational practice of our formal institutions, schools, colleges, universities, but educational practice as it is conducted in the home, educational practice as it is contributed to by the myriad of civil society organizations. These challenges that I've been describing, that we are experiencing in this extraordinary transitional period, will soon reach a climatic stage. This will happen in the next 2 or 3 decades. And at stake will be not only the progress of particular civilizations, but the very future of humanity. And of course, this applies to every society, and it applies to Australia. If I may just finish on this, it applies to Australia with a vengeance. Why do I say that? Because until recently, Australia has seen itself as primarily a country that is part of the West. But it is a country that a Western empire invaded at the expense of its indigenous peoples, its First Nations, and for whom justice has yet to be provided. It is already, as I've said, a society in which increasingly a larger and larger proportion of its population is made up of many cultures, and increasingly the cultures of Asia, whether it be Chinese, Indian, Southeast Asian societies, so on, as well as, of course, the Middle East. And thirdly, its proximity. While the dominant elites of Asia, the dominant elites of Australia may still see their history as located in Europe, the reality is that our future history is located in Asia, or at least in Asia-Pacific. And we have yet to find a way to reconcile our history and our geography. In so many different ways, we are making a mess of this reconciliation, or we are failing to reconcile. The word I'm using deliberately, the word reconciliation. Reconciliation within Australia and reconciliation between Australia and its nearest Asian and Pacific neighbors. And we can see this graphically, and I'm going to stop here, in 3 major contexts. The mess that we have made in our relations with the Muslim world, because we have so foolishly decided to follow everywhere and in all ways the American lead, whether it is in Afghanistan, whether it is in Iraq, or Syria, or Libya, or in the war on terror and the way we handle it even inside Australia. We are seeing it now in the way we're handling the so-called Chinese threat and the enormous anguish that that is now causing to the more than 1 million Australians of Chinese background, at least a very substantial number of them. And thirdly, our stance on climate change and the seeming indifference we have for the main victims of the principal and earliest victims of this likely change, which is our Pacific Island neighbors. So there is this failure to engage in the profound civilizational cultural dialogue that is so crucially needed, so far at any rate, within Australia and in our relationships with our nearest Asian and Pacific neighbors. That is the big agenda before us. Of course, there are a great many people that are beavering away, but there is a long way to go. It is no doubt a difficult and daunting journey, but I take it to be also an exhilarating one in which Australia is uniquely placed by its history and its geography to make a unique difference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Wrote the book Dignity of Difference. And it's made me think, Joe, of a book or an idea by the philosopher and educationist and leadership expert Donella Edwards, where she produced a list of 10 items for effective leadership, which I think you yourself give, and you've alluded to it tonight. And I want to make a question around this. The top of her tree for effective leadership is the capacity to transcend our own paradigm. So, Joe, I don't know how you'd like to answer this, but from your experience and your reflection, what is the capacity for us of a Western enlightened mindset, or a Taliban, or a Chinese Communist Party member to transcend our own paradigms enough to give the attentive listening to each other, which you have modelled in what you've done?
Well, I think the ability, the possibility of doing something like this rests, I think, as much on institutions, in fact, more so on institutions than individuals. Where individuals can play a particularly useful role is to try and breathe new life into institutions. Now, this is a long-winded answer to your question. You see, let's take Australia and China. One of the difficulties of getting a dialogue going at various levels is that certainly on the Australian side, there is so little knowledge of Chinese history, of Chinese culture, of Chinese civilization, which of course, most of which precedes the Communist Revolution, the successful revolution of 1949. There's a whole history. And there is a grave danger, which is the danger that many in Australia fall into, we all do to some extent, is to think that China is the Chinese Communist Party. China is a civilization. It is much, much, much larger than the whole of Europe in population, in regional variations of one kind or another, of backgrounds, of experiences, of insights. We have in this country, even though we have 1 million Chinese Australians, or a bit more than 1 million now, we make so little use of that extraordinary resource at our disposal, which is such a great shame. So you can't have dialogue on the basis of ignorance. You have to have people on either side who have at least some understanding of each other's background. And it's important to see that background as involving so much more than the particular leaning of the current political elite that's in power at a given moment. That's so important. Even with members of the Chinese Communist Party, there are 92 or 93 million of them. And, they operate on so many different levels and at so many different levels in the hierarchy. So, for example, a former PhD of mine, who is now professor at his university in China, in Shanghai, one of the universities, you can have such a rich conversation with him and others like him in the thousands. And their thinking is not a mirror image of what we hear is the particular view of the official Chinese Communist Party in government. So the idea, what I'm trying to say is we need to be able to operate at all these levels, which are societal levels, educationists, scientists, doctors, all the various professions, writers, artists, sports people. We need to be able to connect, not just by competing in sport or just showing a particular artistic group visiting here and an artistic group going there, very good things to happen, but actually sitting down, comparing experiences, understanding where they're coming from, what their hopes and aspirations are, and so on. That kind of long-term, sustained dialogue, which brings two societies together at the very fabric of those societies together. And as you do that, then I think certain things then should become possible, even between the political elites. But at the moment, we are lacking that ballast that in cultural literacy and cultural interaction between ourselves and these societies. And dare I say, we're lacking it even within Australia, between Anglo-Australia and many of the cultural minorities that are now calling Australia home. Yes, we are giving them opportunities, economic, and they can rise in their respective professions. But what use are we making of the cultural resources that they represent? What levels of cultural literacy exist within Australia about the traditions which these cultural minorities within Australia represent? So that's where leadership needs to apply, to be put into effect. And it's not political leadership. It's in the educational arena, in the professional arena, in the business arena, in the artistic arena. And that means it's all within our reach, not the reach out there of the Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition.
Okay, Joe, thanks for that. I want to honour Tony, who was the only one who put a question in the chat, and then come to Les. Tony's question. Tony, would you like to read it? Where's Tony? I'm looking. Yeah. Would you like to read it, Tony? You'll have to unmute.
Yes, or I can just ask the question.
You go on.
I just wonder, Joseph, what you think of is the future for English versus Mandarin in the world?
Well, that's a big question. It's an interesting question. I think it's fair to say that, to break the question down a little bit, that Chinese will certainly replace English in the Asia-Pacific region, especially East Asia-Pacific. I think there are already clear signs that that is happening. On a global scale, it'll be a bit more difficult. We'd have to see, for example, how the Belt and Road Initiative progresses over the next 10 to 15 years. In this area of Asia-Pacific, China has the distinct advantage of very sizable minorities right across East Asia and beyond. Not the case in parts of in Africa, of course, and Latin America or most parts of Europe. So it'll take time. So I don't think I'm confident at all of saying that Chinese will replace English as the dominant international language in a hurry. I don't see how that would happen. It will replace it regionally, and it will certainly be accepted as one of the major international languages, together with English, until recently, for example, French has been acknowledged, and for that matter now Spanish and Arabic and so on. So it's a process, but it's fair to say that in the world today, because of population, many more people have Chinese as their first language than people have English as their first language because of China's extraordinarily large population, to which you must add all the Chinese minorities around the world. So yes, there is that going for it, but to emerge as the dominant language diplomatically in the business world and so on would take quite a bit of time, if it ever happens. I don't know, can't predict that one.
Liz?
Thanks, Paul. Actually, that was my hand clapping and not my hand up before to ask a question. But
one hand clapping.
If it should be a symbol of two hands clapping. I'll have a look later.
Okay.
But if nobody else has a question, I do have a question for Joe. I'm wondering about whether China's huge economic growth is sustainable. I've seen some serious commentary saying that the huge economic growth in China is done by the state. The activity is done by the state. And for example, the massive building works in many cities in China, that many of them are just vacant blocks. So the commentary is that this economic growth is not really sustainable in the longer term. Well, not only just in the longer term, there's already pressures on sustaining it. And secondly, if we're relying on the figures that are coming out of China for the various indicators for economic growth, I see a lot of commentary that those figures are pretty rubbery.
Yes, but I think one should take some of this commentary with a grain of salt. They've been predicting it for the last 30 years, and nothing has come of it so far. The Chinese bureaucracy has no match anywhere in the world. Now, we've got that has not seeped through. It has no match. It can build a city in the matter of a few months. It could create 6 hospitals in 12 days. And of course, that's where a lot of people who were diagnosed with COVID were able to go. Whereas for Western countries to do that, it takes an eternity. It takes a long time by comparison. The second thing that's worth saying, the Chinese bureaucracy is now so capable, extraordinarily capable, it is planning in terms of a minimum of 3 decades ahead, right? Most of the problems that the West identifies, they thought of 15 to 20 years ago in detail, minute detail, extraordinary detail. So yes, things can go wrong. Human beings are prone to getting things wrong. So yes, that can happen. But the indicators are that at the moment, the government structures, the state structures of China are capable, one, of foreseeing problems on the horizon, to some extent preventing them, and when they do eventually appear, and they can't be prevented fully, they have very substantial capacities for responding to them and responding quickly. So does it mean that it'll be a simple line of progress? No, it'll have its ups and downs. But if you look decade in, decade out, I would expect the growth will continue, but at a lower rate. Of course, it'll be a lower rate. And in fact, the government in the last several years has tried to push growth down because it's worried about its unsustainability, and also where it's now putting much more emphasis on reducing inequalities, which are very, very substantial in China, and a little less emphasis on growth, which is very interesting. So the latest edict, if you like, from the president is that the entire Chinese Communist Party and the government structures must address the problem of economic and social inequality as their prior objective, and they must be held to account every 5 years for progress achieved. Now, we shall see how well that's implemented. But what I'm saying is China is not wedded anymore to huge growth rates of the kind we've seen in the past, 9 to 10%. It'll probably be quite happy with 4 to 5% within the next 5 to 6 years, and more attention on spreading the capacity of a larger society to take advantage. It's now of economic prosperity. The inward now in China is common prosperity. There is prosperity, but it is shared unevenly, and it's recognized as the major issue confronting Chinese society today, the sharp inequalities between very rich and very poor.
Okay, I'll just keep us moving, and people will pick up things. Stephen, thank you.
Yes, Joe, thanks very much for a very cultivated lecture in the grand tradition of, the British Empire from 50 years ago or more. But I was just wondering, really, this idea that the West has somehow fallen behind. Yeah, that could be true, but there was that grand achievement. That was when 12 Americans walked on the moon and left their flag there. And that's not even been equalled by the Americans now. I mean, really, a place like China or a place like India, to summon up anything like the cultural depth or spirit or imagination that built the West as we know it, you have to actually get up there and do something similar. Until I see that, I won't believe a thing other than general decline.
Well, I don't know how one answers that question. I'm one that attaches much less importance to technological advances. My yardsticks are what are we doing to develop human well-being in all its forms, cultural flourishing, cultural and literacy, education at a high level. What are we doing to raise the level of human conversation, empathy, and compassion? And I think on this, we haven't been doing all that well. So we can do the most extraordinary technological feats. We can one day have a little colony on one of the planets, even one of the more distant ones. But I say, so what, unless the well-being of humanity and its future haven't been advanced as a result. They're the yardsticks, and they apply to everyone, not just to the United States or Europe. They apply to China. China has to show, if it's going to be seriously considered as offering any useful lessons, whether it can do very much to deal with the major problems that are confronting humanity at this time. Whether it be climate change, whether it be pandemics, whether it be financial crises, rising economic inequalities. These are the big challenges we face. Fake news, the disregard for truth in reporting and analysis, and so on. So these are the big challenges we face, and any society, any culture, at the end of the day, will be judged on its contribution to helping us find answers to these enormous challenges we face for the
Joe,
future.
can I push you to a really specific?
Yes.
Just to speak for yourself rather than argue it. Do you believe the Chinese, for example, are as capable or more capable of meeting those challenges that you have just outlined than the perhaps decadent West?
As of now, yes.
Okay.
You wanted a short answer.
No, good. And that's good. Now, I want others to put their questions. I think, Robert, what you've written here is important. I'll refer everyone to the chat. And what Robert's written, which he might like to comment on, is, if I read it right, the distinction between the multicultural and the multi-ethnic, or Joe, it's about how next gen, or we might say second gen, ethnicities end up being middle-class Australians with only a very light sprinkling of their culture. But Robert, would you like to add to that, as you said, from your Polish background?
My parents identified very, very strongly with East European culture, which is where they originated. All of their children, all of their grandchildren identify totally as Australians, but they have abandoned any serious interest in anything that goes on in Poland. And I suspect most Chinese and Vietnamese and Indonesians and so forth, Lebanese, by the third generation have lost any real connection with the home country that the pioneering migrants identified still very strongly with. For example, I was a tutor to a Lebanese Jehovah's Witness family when I was looking after migrants, asylum seekers for a while, and they had Lebanese news on non-stop, 24 hours, and they identified very, very strongly with Lebanon. But their children, the young children that I talked to quite a lot, identified far, far more as Australians because they were going to school with fellow Australians. And I think they had lost, or they didn't share the interest that the parents, the first generation migrants, had. And the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Italians, the Greeks, the Czechs that I know identify very, very strongly as Australians and have pretty much lost all identification with their original culture. And therefore the growth of ethnic minorities in Australia to some extent is irrelevant, in that people lose their ethnic identifications after a while. The other thing which I very strongly agree with Joe is about the appalling insularity of this culture and the American culture in terms of learning about other cultures. We expect everybody who comes here to learn to speak English proper, and we refuse to be bilingual in any meaningful way. And that's just appalling. The ignorance here is just astonishing.
So, Robert, what would be a question, or Joe, what would be your drawing on that in relationship to things you've said, the tendency for those marvellous differences, if I read Robert correctly, to kind of either disappear or they get absorbed into the larger mix and the differences are no longer as crucial after the second generation as they seemed at first?
Yes, there is an element of truth about that, an important one. But with a lot of, but things are changing and have been changing for a while. There is a tendency with a number of communities for the second generation to want to distinguish itself, to break from the cultural pull of the first generation. But we are finding, I think, more and more that third generation are moving back. And there are some that have never really moved very much. So if you look, and that's one point. The second point is that a lot of communities are very good at disguising their true identities and cultural affinities when they are in the midst of Anglo-Australians. When they are in conversation with Anglo-Australians, which then would happen in schools, which would happen at work, in most workplaces. But where there are workplaces, and there are a number of them, where the majority is non-Anglo, you see a different atmosphere emerging. And that's why, for example, in a number of schools and in a number of workplaces, there is now a very strong push for services to be provided that are culturally sensitive, because people still maintain that connection. The other point, which I think is in agreement with what was being put, is that to some extent, or rather, let me put it this way, to the extent that it is true that some communities it is true that they're losing their identification with their home country. That's not, for me, the real issue. The real issue is not whether I can maintain links with a home country, meaning links with what's happening day to day in the home country, but that I maintain a view of the world which is not necessarily the Anglo view. So, for example, you would find very few monarchists amongst most of our non-Anglo communities. For them, the British Empire, the monarchy mean very little. And they may pay lip service to those things, but it's not in their DNA the way it is for a substantial number of Anglo-Australians. And that's the last point I'm coming to. There is a precious resource in these other cultures that are now in Australia, and we should be trying to cultivate them because they're useful for making Australia a richer place, a more humane place than it might otherwise be. So to the extent that there is a push towards uniformity, if anything, we should be trying to reverse it, not accepting it as a fait accompli.
Now, folks, Jenny has a question. I've checked. We advertised our program tonight to run from 7:30 to 9, and we can be a bit flexible, but while Jenny's asking a question, if there's no other question flagged, we will round off our meeting. Is everyone happy with that? Thank you, Jenny.
Joe, thanks very much for your talk. I was very relieved in one sense to hear you being optimistic about China, because partly what was going through my mind as you spoke were some of the aspects of Chinese society that we hear through the news, one being fairly drastic censorship of the internet in China, and the other is, the court cases that we hear about, the Australian Chinese journalist who's been imprisoned and without much sense of due process as we would understand it. And so, to one extent, I know you wanting to emphasize the idea that we need to be expanding the conversation. But on the other hand, here's this sort of sense of conversation or dialogue being gagged or limited at that point. The other thing I wondered if you might comment on is we're very well aware that the diplomatic service, the budget for the diplomatic service, the Australian diplomatic service, is being reduced. I would see that it would be very important for us to see leadership in terms of discourse and dialogue and sensitivity in these areas. And would you comment about that? And, is that an area that we need to be not only alert, but rather active towards advocating for greater breadth and depth?
Yes. The first question, the first point you raised is a big one, important one. There is much that is happening in China, the result of government policy. which one would want to take exception to. Although I should qualify it and say, don't believe everything that you read in Western media. Don't believe it. There are some accurate reporting and there are some exaggerations. Some of our leading Australian historians, who are very well versed in the question of Chinese minorities, for example, do recognize that there are human rights issues that are human rights that are being infringed, but nothing quite on the scale that is being suggested. But anyhow, there are human rights issues, right? No question. And Australia should be able to discuss those. But then we should also try and put our own house in order. Otherwise, our concerns carry no credibility whatever. When we have this high level, and of course the Chinese pick them up, when we have these high levels of indigenous incarceration, young indigenous people incarcerated at many, many times the rate at which non-indigenous counterparts are incarcerated, when we deal with asylum seekers the way we do, and so on. In other words, to use the biblical phrase, he that is without sin, let him cast the first stone. So we have an obligation to put our own house in order. Number two, if we're going to deal with human rights violations, conduct, practices that we think we have difficulty with, we've got to do it equally around the world. You can't do it with respect to China and turn a blind eye when it happens in India. You can't do it with respect to North Korea, which we should, and ignore it when it happens to Saudi Arabia, because those two, India and Saudi Arabia, have been chosen to be other friends or allies by the United States, and therefore you don't interfere. You have to be fearless, and you have to do it without fear or favor. And then you become more credible. You're doing it at home, you're dealing with human rights, you're inviting the Chinese to openly come here and be critical of our performance and say, can we come and do the same in China? Then it becomes an equal. But if it is done in a way that we pontificate on the grounds that we have these wonderful human rights values and practices in this country, everything is beautiful here and everything is terrible there, then you can't have the dialogue. You have to accept that there are many things we do which are not acceptable. And similarly, there are things that happen there which are not acceptable. And then you can begin the dialogue. What can we do better? And ideally, what can we do better together? The final point about that issue is, in taking issue with what's happening in China or anywhere else, the point of it must never be in order to make noise. If you're really concerned about the people of Xinjiang, right? If you're really concerned, you want to take action that makes their life better. And there is no evidence whatever that the Australian government we currently have has done the slightest little bit to think through what actions can we take that might make their plight a little bit better, at least, than it is now. They're not interested. They're using it as point-scoring exercise in a diplomatic tug of war, and it's quite unhelpful and counterproductive. Now, your second point is very important, and that is the continuous rundown of the foreign affairs or diplomatic arm of government. It's been happening for years, probably for decades, and to some extent under both Labour and Liberal governments or coalition governments. And it's tragic. Over the last 30 or more years, the way Australia relates to the outside world is less and less and less influenced by the Department of Foreign Affairs and more influenced by the security establishment, meaning the Department of Defense, the armed forces, and in particular, the security and intelligence agencies. And that's one of the saddest chapters in recent Australian history. The shift of initiative and leverage within the government structure. And this has been further, if you like, accentuated by the fact that we now have the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, so that even within Foreign Affairs, such energy as there is geared primarily to defending trade interests than defending diplomatic or peace-building initiatives and policies. So yes, it is quite tragic, and this is something about which the Australian community is not particularly apprised of, and is not at the moment raising it even as a point of discussion, let alone as a major political issue. So the more we can do to raise the profile of this question, the better Australia will be served.
There's exactly the same issue in the USA, the radical decline in the State Department and the rise of Homeland Security. It mirrors exactly what's happening here.
That's right.
Well, look, Joe, thank you. I think it's great that you've brought to what you've shared a very personal and on-the-ground experience in Melbourne that I know of being in conversation between different groups of perhaps first gen, second gen, perhaps different groups from the same country I'm aware of. And we don't underestimate the perspective you develop from that. I also appreciate that Joe has his ears amongst a number of his doctoral students in other places. I think even having one in Shanghai like that would be pretty significant for allowing you, Joe, to get a more balanced view than some of us could get just by reading our newspapers. So thank you for everything you've shared. I think it's quite appropriate in a sense that you've ended on a somber note. It's a somber note, and it comes back to where we began, Jenny, the recognition of the Indigenous. And coming to that, it's just a crying shame about the incarceration rate of Indigenous young people and women. And I'm not going to say anything other than what can we do about it. But that brings us full circle tonight. And with that, I think it's my task to wish you all well and to tell Joe, when COVID's over, I want to have another lunch because you didn't answer my question the way I wanted. Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. And we bid you good night.
Good night.
Good night, Joe. And Jenny, you can close us down in one fell swoop. Thank you.